Hi,
Hi.
hi everyone. I'm here with Dr. Roger Maurice. He's a Peruvian anthropologist with a PhD in applied anthropology from the University of South Florida. He's a professor of international relations at University of San Ignacio de Loyola. Also, he's an investigator in that area and specializes in participatory methodologies and cultural diversity. His expertise makes him an excellent resource to explore the topic of stereotypes from an anthropologist's perspective. Hi, Roger. How are you
Hi.
doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Good to see you again.
Well, as I mentioned before, in this interview, we're gonna make an interview about stereotypes. I would like to start. How would you define a stereotype from an anthropologist's perspective?
Well, I guess stereotypes within anthropology, as well as the general definitions, imply overgeneralized intuitions and overgeneralized statements about a group of people. I think that's what stereotypes are.
Well, you were a teacher many years in the United States. Do you face any stereotypes being a teacher over there?
Yeah, and I think I was thinking about not stereotypes, difficult, like challenges maybe, because perhaps because of stereotypes that I don't like since I've been a professor, an instructor first and then a professor since 2007 until 2017, so it's about 10 years. So maybe on one occasion, what I think was based on stereotypes, I faced some sort of aggression from a student, verbal aggression, right? Like public, in my classes, because my classes were like 100 student
Yeah.
auditorium classes, right? So that was a difficult situation, but I think I knew how to handle it, and I handled it well. But most of the time, and I think that's what I was saying before, like because students respect who you are based on how you present yourself, and I would introduce myself as who I was, and also because of the PhD, right? Because I was a doctor, they would respect probably more the degree than I mean, that's my assumption, than they would myself, right? Because I was a professor in the south and in the north of the US. And the south of the US has a history. White folks, right? If you want to talk about people, and that's probably not the right way of saying it, but most of my students were Euro descendant students, a few Latinos and a few African Americans. So most of the students were different from who I was, and they probably exoticized me as being somebody from, and like I said, because I said who I was and where I came from, and because this was an anthropology programs in both universities, it was easier in that sense because they had some appreciation of diversity.
Well, to finish about the cultural and historical context, how do historical events contribute to the creation of modern stereotypes?
Immensely. I mean, history. I mean, just think about the history of science. The history of science created one of the greatest myths, which is the idea of race. Right? And these were scientists of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries that created the idea that race is a fact. Well, race is a social construction. So these are social, historical, scientific constructions that had a historical process that created an idea that is so immersed in global society today. People believe in race. People treat others based on what they think are racial characteristics, right? And it has nothing to do with being racial characteristics. It's just human biological diversity that creates those, differences that you see in people. But so yes, there's a great influence of history on myths and stereotypes that people believe in nowadays. Yeah.
I think your investigation can you discover?
Okay, so as any other indigenous population in the Amazon or in Peru, of course, there are stereotypes previous to your entering the field. Of course, as an anthropologist, I do field work. So probably because I'm an anthropologist, I might have been aware before entering the field about what stereotypes are. But usually the stereotypes about indigenous people are that they are not educated, right, primitive, savages. So those typical things that people talk about when they refer to indigenous populations. But so I had to deal with those thoughts in my mind. But I had read ahead of time, and I have met people from that indigenous group before. So one thing that I have to do as an anthropologist is try to apply some sort of neutrality before I talk to people. So I know I got my preconceived notions or my preconceived ideas about the Awahun, but I had to put those back in the back of my mind and just move forward with getting to know people from the very beginning. That's what I had to do.
That stereotype that you say that people have about indigenous people, how that stereotype emerges within societies?
Oh, the historical processes play a role in stereotypes. Scientific history, popular history, the media, right? The media plays a role too. So that's usually how they come to be.
And now that you mentioned the media, how the media you can say that can influence that
It could be movies, it could be newspapers, and again, it's usually not well informed, or because they promote other kinds of information or scientific, science fiction or things like that. I don't remember the name, but I do remember a movie about the Awahun related groups from Peru and Ecuador that they used to call the head shrinkers of the Amazon from 1950s, something around there. So Hollywood already had played a role in stigmatizing the Awahun as savages that would shrink heads.
How can anthropologists study the stereotypes without reinforcing them?
Anthropologists are just human beings like anybody else. So yeah, I mean, there's that chance, because I've met anthropologists that stereotype people too. There's that chance that we can just stereotype folks just as anybody else. But I guess one thing that we do as anthropologists is we use what we call reflexivity, which comes from more of a school, a postmodern school, where we try to become aware of who we are, the power relationships that we have with people that we encounter, and our own biographies. So when you try to get deeper into your own life, who you are, how you were raised, and everything, somehow you become aware of the power that you have to portray, lies and stereotypes about people. So that's how we do it, I guess. Oh, that's how I do it,
And you, as an anthropologist, have you faced any ethical challenge?
Oh, plenty.
Can you give us an example?
Ooh.
How do you face it?
In terms of stereotypes, I can think of any, but I mean, I might have had my preconceived notions about the Awahun before I entered the field. But I entered first. Okay, then again, this could be something that portrays a stereotype about the Awahun, which doesn't really happen. But there's a tradition, an old tradition that I read about that is called reserving a wife. So this is kind of problematic. So usually in these ancient societies, because women menstruate early, right? So there's that tendency of thinking of a girl who's 11 to be a woman. So I don't know if I told you that story in class. Yeah, I told you that story in class in Spanish, right? So that's an ethical dilemma that I remember. So there was this custom that anthropologists called reserving a wife. I remember the anthropologist that I read that book early in my career that is called the Jíbaro, which is probably a way of portraying stereotypes. So the Jíbaro by Michael Harner talks about that custom of reserving a wife. So I came across that situation when I was 25, when a person that I was interviewing who was singing songs for me and I was recording them this was 1995, he offered me his daughter, his 11-year-old daughter, to be my wife and take her. And of course, I didn't take her, but I had to be very concrete and very respectful in my way of saying and rejecting the offer, right? So yeah, that's probably an ethical dilemma that I faced, which being very careful in telling you the story, because it might portray the stereotype of them giving away their children, which doesn't happen. I mean, it's not something that happens all the time, but there used to be a tradition like that back in the day, not anymore.
And moving to media and representation, what impact does media representation have on the persistence of the stereotypes?
I guess it comes back to movies, it comes back to misinformation, because misrepresentation comes from many different angles. Back in 2017, which is the year that I came back to Peru, is it 2000? Yeah. I was teaching college. I might have told you that story. But I was teaching college at Rockford University in Illinois, and they invited me to give a talk about the Awahun, right? So my talk was about the Awahun, the traditions and everything. And I remember when they showed me, they very proudly showed me the museum. One of the halls was the hall of Native American indigenous people, something like that. And they showed, like, they had like different displays with glass windows like that, where they showed different cultures in South America. And one of them was the Awahun, and they had a shrunken head, right? Which is a rarity, a human shrunken head. So when they do that, and that's an educational setting, right? So that's a museum. So when they do that, they show you that the Awahun are head shrinkers. And the Awahun are not head shrinkers. They were at one point in their lives, right? So that's a misrepresentation, right? So and I mean, I again, it's an ethical dilemma in a way, in some sorts, because I had to, tell them, but I had to be very careful telling them, this is not who the Awahun are. There's been like so many years after that. So what you're doing is, you're misrepresenting what the Awahun are. But I was like really careful when I mean, I didn't do it in public, but there was a curator of the museum, so I approached her later after that, and I said, this is what happens.
And well, do you think any stereotypes has passed across generation, even though
Oh yeah,
our society, they say,
changed.
changed?
Stereotypes are perpetuated through generations because they are transmitted from generation to generation. People are there's a term that we use in anthropology that's enculturated, right? Enculturation is a process by which you learn society based on what your parents teach you, and your parents teach you stuff based on what they learn from society. So it's a vicious circle. So those stereotypes get just passed on from generation to generation until somebody debunks them, right? Or yes, that's usually the way it happens. Yeah.
And stereotypes, are stereotypes universal across cultures, or do they vary
No.
across the culture norms?
They are universal. All cultures have. It has to do with preservation. I mean, it's tricky to answer that question. Not that you're asking a tricky question, but it's tricky to answer a question like that because it has to do with how we learn things and how humanity has evolved with our brain to preserve a group, right? And teach, teach humanity. Like the brain has to do with it, the way we symbolize things. So at one point, stereotypes are the way that you learn the in-group norms, right? And as a consequence, because of the way you symbolize and learn things, you create outside groups. So you create what we call also the othering of people, right? So you create the us and the other. So this is something that has to do with our evolution. But again, because it's the brain that created that, the brain can also create concepts like ethnocentrism, which is part of what causes stereotypes. Ethnocentrism is how we usually preserve the group by thinking that our group is better or better than other groups. So based on and because the human brain also creates these concepts, we can also debunk ideas like stereotypes. So I think it's a process. At one point, I think humanity needed ethnocentrism to make us who we are. But nowadays, ethnocentrism and what comes with it, the stereotypes, are not functional. So I think it's something that human beings have to re-educate themselves to learn that, you know, stereotypes are not good.
Do you have any example of how ethnocentrism now is not helping us to being a really good society?
Oh, because that's what creates the conflicts between groups based on, you know, your religious belief, or you know, when we have immigrant populations, or you know, that's based on stereotypes. We blame the immigrants on everything that happens, right? There might be one or two elements in immigrant populations that create, you know, that do bad things, but it's not everybody.
Not
so yeah, so that's ethnocentrism, and that happens not just in Peru; it happens in the United States all the time, right? I was a Hispanic in the U.S. I was a Latino in the U.S. So, you know, I was a minority in the U.S. So, you know, I know as an immigrant, which is what I was, right? What it's like, you know, not to be in the dominant group, right? And in Peru, I'm part of the dominant group, right? But wiser, because I learned a lot about that, right? And I think you yourself, by being in the U.S. like a couple of times or one time, you know, so you've learned that too.
They really put us like in a bag of everyone.
Sure. Everybody's
even though when you are as a J1 visa, even though when in that program with the Americas is the same, because they know that we here we live different as they over there.
Sure. So and they have their own stereotypes about you, right? Or about us. Yeah, so that's true.
How can education or intercultural dialogue can help to reduce this?
I guess conversations like what we're doing right now, you know, this as an interview, as a class. I used to teach, which is a class that I think we should have here. Well, I don't know if it applies to any of the majors, but we should have a class. I used to teach exploring cultural diversity. I used to teach that class in the U.S. And I would get folks from different majors, and we would talk about who we are. We would talk about concepts like race, ethnicity, stereotypes. All these things would come up in classes. I think the closest to that would be here in UCIL would be Realidad Nacional, but maybe not. I don't know.
Well, this class is ethics and communication, and we talk about everything.
Okay, so
stereotypes,
there you go.
Ethics and dilemma of journalism. They focus on.
Yeah, that's good because but you do it in your major, right? But in our major, we don't have anything like that. So folks in any major, usually they take Realidad Nacional, and that depends on how you teach it. Yeah, it's different, but I like that, you know, ethics and communications, or ethics in communication.
Ethics and communications.
Great, yeah.
And just to finish, any advice of you as an anthropologist and also as an internationalist, because you were in
well, I guess I as an applied anthropologist, I can work in any field if I learn about the field, and I'm learning, you know, something that you keep learning every day. So as advice, well, keep doing what you do, because, and I tell my students the same thing, you know, keep learning about people. Usually internationalists, for instance, they look at things based on theories, you know, UN, the United Nations, International Labor Organization, everything that comes from the multilateral aspect. And I tell them and I teach them to learn, and that's top-bottom. Usually, or diplomacy, top-bottom, right? And I teach them to learn bottom-up. So the stories about the Awahun that Olenka tells you, you know, keep talking about, is because I learned myself, you know, to work out of my stereotypes, my you know, whatever preconceived notions that I've had, and I probably keep having because I'm a human being. I do things bottom up, and I teach them to work things bottom up, you know, to learn about people, to talk to people. right? Because you're an internationalist doesn't mean that you have to be a diplomat only, right? You
Yeah.
can work with folks in NGOs and do interviews, do participant observation, do ethnographies, which is what I'm doing with my students. So my students are doing ethnographies nowadays, great ethnographies for their thesis work, yeah.
Well, Lenka say that you are like Barbies. You can do whatever you want internationally. So.
There you go.
Thank you for this interview.